One thing is clear to me. Sustainability and compliance are going to mean the same thing in the future. And to answer the question, what specific requirements are going to be there in the future regarding materials, I brought on Julian Lotz once again to the podcast. Julian is the co-founder and CEO of BIOVOX, which is a manufacturer of sustainable medical grade plastics. And in this episode, you're going to learn that material compliance and sustainability are converging and what regulatory requirements they are going to bring to the future in regards to material selection, and how to future-proof yourself now in order to gain a strategic advantage later when the regulations hit the market. I'm Lucas Penegonda and I helped over 30 MedTech companies to be more sustainable with plastics. If you're interested in that, there's a link in the description, and here's our discussion. Hi, Julian, and welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Lucas, and welcome all outside to our new episode.
Yeah. So the reason I invited you is I attended a talk of you where you talked about sustainability compliance. This was at the Tech Days of the Masterflex Group in Novoplast Halberstadt. And you talked about how material compliance and sustainability regulations are converging. And why do you think this is? And could you explain a little bit on what's your take on that whole sustainability compliance topic?
So for me, that's two sides of the same medal. In the end, with the material compliance that we know so far, we try to protect patients, for example, but also the environment. If we look at critical substances, plasticizers, PFAS, whatever, there's always those two topics. We don't want to harm the patients and we don't want to harm the planet if we find out that some substances are maybe very critical for the environment. And in the end, if we look at, for example, recyclability, circular economy, carbon emissions, etc., that all has an impact onto our environment, and the environment has an impact also on our health and safety. So in the end, all of these topics are revolving around protection of health, and protection of health is also convergent with protection of environment. But for example, with increasing temperatures, we will have more cardiovascular problems, we will have more respiratory problems, for example. And if you are coming from the patient safety side or if you're coming from the environmental side, that's pretty much the same. The conclusion is that the materials that we use have to be harmless to the world, basically.
Okay. So EU regulations are increasing their pace, and our listeners usually can't even keep up with the speed and uncertainty of these regulations. So what uncertainty in your eyes will materials bring that we currently use, and how can we make materials future-proof?
So there's different aspects of that. The easiest might be the biological safety point of materials. So we don't want to have critical substances that are affecting, for example, the health of the patients as an endocrine disruptor, or by introducing any changes to the hormones that we have, or act hormone-like, for example. So that's something where we learn more and more about and see that even very small amounts of some substances can have an effect on health. Or if we look at the climate side of things, then of course we don't want to waste resources. We don't want to waste energy. So we will be more competitive if we use materials that are low in resource and energy consumption, therefore having a low carbon footprint and therefore doing not as much damage to the environment in the other impact categories. And for me, it's an optimization problem. If we come up with materials that are within planetary boundaries and at the same time don't emit critical substances, then we should be compliant in the long term. And that is quite agnostic to the polymers itself. For example, it's a lot about the way that we produce them. What are the feedstocks? Is it recycling? Is it bio-based, for example, or is it fossil materials? And also, how efficiently are we doing that? And are we incorporating additives, for example, plasticizers, etc., that have some effect on the health or not? That's main thing, I think.
So for you, is substances of concern contained or potential substances of concern contained, and the environmental footprint overall? So whatever that may be in terms of CO2, land use, water use, whatever impact categories you want to analyze. So low environmental footprint and no substances of concern. I mean, you could ecotoxicity and effect on human health could be an impact category that you would be looking at, but you would specifically be looking out for those substances already regulated by something like REACH, ROS, and other material compliance regulations. And on top of that, whatever could be landing on those said restriction or notification lists. Okay, so what regulations do you think will hit in the midterm future?
Besides, you already mentioned REACH, that will be the place to go to look out for new critical substances, and the list is growing and growing. Besides that, I think it's actually regulation that has impact on the markets directly. I will try and share one slide that I also had at Novo Plus Tech Days. So I went through a lot of the different EU regulations that are upcoming. And of course, we know some of the regulations like HOP REACH, SVHCs, California Proposition 65 TSCA. So that's what we see all of the time in healthcare, in regulatory information sheets, for example, and regarding documentation. But there are, for example, the NHS Scope 3 requirements. NHS, with the Greener NHS program, from mid-26 on, they require their suppliers to have a strategy that aligns with the NHS sustainability goals. And from mid of 26, they require the strategy to include their Scope 3. So if you are, for example, being very efficient with your primary energies that you use, you have your solar panels on the rooftop, you have a electrical car park in the company, etc. That's great. But for NHS, you will be required to have also materials, plastics, for example, and strategies for that, how to reduce their environmental footprint. That directly affects the market. And there's other ones like the Sustainable Product Design Regulation. There we have, for example, one part included, that's the green public purchasing that we see here under the first exclamation mark sign, where the European Union gives the opportunity to the member states to, by law, demand a certain threshold of sustainable products to be purchased from the public sector. And they have a maximum yield of 50%. And of course, it's a delegated law. So the member states, they will have to dial in what they see as a proper solution for their economy and their sustainability goals. But up to 50% of the purchased goods can be, by law, sustainable ones. And I guess they won't go for 0.1% because all of the states have their goals. So that will be a significant impact on the market. If you have sustainable products, you will be able to compete for tenders more easily than if you don't have such solutions. Or, of course, the PPWR, there we have currently not as many regulations regarding healthcare. Pharma packaging is exempt for the moment, MedTech primary packaging. But for that, I see if there are solutions in the market that work very well, then the politics will adopt solutions that are safe and working for food packaging, for example, also for pharma packaging, medical packaging in the long run.
Okay. I mean, I recently dove a little into detail on the Green Deal, and I might just share another slide to trump yours. No, just joking. But I have one thing on the PPWR, and I think MedTech thinks they are exempt for most of it, but actually they're exempt for little of it. So the PPWR exempts so-called contact-sensitive packaging, which is pharma primary packaging, medical device, and in vitro diagnostic packaging, if from two things. And one is the recyclability minimum requirements and from the minimal recycling content. Those two exemptions are made, meaning that your medical device packaging doesn't need to be recyclable. and doesn't need to contain recycling content. However, you will be penalized for a non-recyclable packaging via an extended producer responsibility scheme. So you will have to register your packaging and then assess its conformity to the PPWR. On top, you will have to calculate your recyclability and be paying a fee according to the recyclability. So if you're badly recyclable, you will pay more for your packaging. And you're not exempt from that, even if you're pharmaceutical packaging. So I think what we have to get away from a little bit is that, we're going to get an exemption, because the exemption for MedTech is until 35. And if the EU regulatory bodies see that there are technically feasible solutions available, your exemption is going to go away with the delegated act very fast. And this is what we have to see with this Green Deal regulations, the ESPR that you mentioned and you called, I think, sustainable design. Let's say eco-design for sustainable product regulation, it's called. And the PPWR, both of them are frameworks that are able to be fine-tuned to the state of the art very easily. And this is going to hit MedTech like a tsunami, in my opinion. This was also the reason why I wanted to bring you on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly share one slide that shows the MedTech Europe's analysis of the regulatory density of MedTech. With this slide, you can see basically the overview over the regulations that MedTech is currently in scope of. So we have a bunch of regulations that are on legal certainty and transparency. Those are the CSRD, the CS3D, stuff like that, where you have to basically do sustainability reporting. Then there is a bunch of stuff where we are in scope, and for like the MDR and the IVDR, we know that, of course. And then this whole green chunk, you don't have to be able to read everything, but this is basically everything that ensures the protection of people and planet. And here we have REACH, CLP, PPWR, ESPR, then the deforestation regulation, Green Claims Directive. So there's a regulatory tsunami coming towards MedTech that we're currently not ready for. And we think we are going to get exemptions for everything. So maybe to play the ball back to you, what's your take on this?
It's funny, I shared exactly this slide a few weeks ago to the team, and we were all more or less happy and celebrating a bit as we try to have solutions for that tsunami with our materials. That's also what was the key message in Halberstadt at Novo Plus with my slide. Basically, if you are now developing a new medical device, there will be a large amount of regulation. I think from 2030 on, it gets really acute before you can get through, but then the first hard regulation will hit and you will just have way worse market circumstances to sell your product. Market access will vanish, or you will have just bad edge over the competition. The complexity that we get with all of this regulation, that's the true difficult part that I see. Because if you have materials that contain critical substances that are not banned from MedTech maybe, but from other applications like some PFAS topics, or if you have no recyclability in your packaging, as you said, you can cover that for a while, maybe with paying higher prices for raw materials or fines for non-recyclability. But in the end, if you don't rethink how you work with materials and try to get out every risk factor within a material, then you are risking your market access in the not so long run, actually. And this tsunami, as you call it, will contribute. And that's why I came up with the idea of staying within planetary boundaries as good as possible, and getting rid of critical substances should keep you quite safe, because all of these single regulations, they might require some forms to fill out, some reporting, etc. But regarding the physical object that you are creating, if you are sustainable by the definition of being in planetary boundaries, if you keep out critical substances, that should keep you fine from what's been questioned by the regulation, and of course being able to do circular economy. But planetary boundaries, I think, are mostly only achievable if we have a circular economy and recyclability, recycling content.
Yeah, I mean, my take on it is, what you hear currently a lot is like, sustainability has a little bit deprioritized. The European Union does a bunch of simplifications. Some call it paddling back on what the Green Deal is. In my opinion, it's political weather currently, and the ability to distinguish between weather and climate is very important, because currently it may be a bad time with the trade wars going on, new administration in the US and all that stuff going on. But I don't think that the European Union is going to go to paddle back on the Green Deal. So it's on the table. It's not going to go away. And maybe it's going to be a little bit later or not as harsh, but the requirements will come. And I did a lot of calls with customers and potential customers in the last half year. I think it was 55. And I asked these two questions. So number one is, do you think that in the future, the requirements for eco-design will be harsher or more strict in the form for medical technology? And the answer, if yes, then how long will that go until they come into force? And I had 0 people tell me no. I think those people who would tell me no will not even speak to me. I can't imagine that there's no one out there who thinks it's no. Then it's like a quarter who says, I don't know. I'm not qualified to answer this. And then there's like, I think 40 to 50% there was that said 5 or 7 years. So 5 to 7 years, that is like the general consensus. There's a few, let's say, people who think it's going to be sooner and some that think it's going to be later. Some said 10 years, some said 3 years. But it's around in the 10-year mark. So the next 10 years, we're going to have it. And then the follow-up question I always ask is, okay, and how long does it take you to develop a device and bring it to market? And then it's usually silence, because it's also around that 5 to 7 to 10-year mark in order to get a complex medical device to market. Good. And I think we'll have to adapt and we'll have to prepare for this sustainability compliance. You might also like reshare your slide, because I think you had a skull on there, and just to iterate on what you mean by this skull, because I think the takeaway of the skull was brilliant.
Yeah, that's exactly the story that you just drew up. And from your calls with your customers, that's the idea behind the slide. If you start developing your device today, then you're in market maybe 28, 29, something like that, if you are rather quick. And then you might have those 2-3 years until the tsunami hits. That's also, I'd guess, 2030 is a major tipping point for regulation regarding materials and sustainability. Might be 32 or so, but 5 years I also think is a good estimate. And from then on, it gets darker and darker regarding market access, regarding your competitiveness. Of course, you can be cheap, but that alone won't get you all tenders. And if you're in a good market position today, neglect sustainability, that will vanish. And if you're looking past 2035, it's getting pretty dark, because even if the EU is slower with regulation, I am also with you that they won't dial it all back. I'll have a sentence to that later on, but then you will actually lose your market access within a time frame where you usually want to have your product on the market still without changes in best case. Because if you have it on the market 2-3 years and then start to change materials, design, tooling, etc., that's really expensive. Of course, we all know that. It's actually cheaper to now prepare for the legislation that we will see 2030, 31, 32 maybe, because then you have less changes in the end.
You could take your graph here and replace the axis with project time spent, and on the y-axis you could like cost of the material change, and then the graph would still be valid. So the earlier you change a material or you define the right material, the less costly it's going to be. If you are going with a material change late in the project, even if it's on market, it's borderline impossible to change a material, because if you have a mold that is optimized for one type of material. You have a mold that is maybe also like a multi-cavity mold. Usually a one cavity mold is easier to change over than like a 128 cavity mold, because it has to be balanced, it has to be perfectly aligned with the material and its flowability and its viscosity at higher temperatures and all that stuff. And then revalidation and reapproval. So the longer your device is on the market, or the further it is in the development process, to change a material late in the development process or when it's on market, it's going to be very, very expensive. So you do not want to choose a material that gets banned in 5 years. You just want to avoid that.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what I meant with material risks in euros. So the later you are basically bound to change something by legislation, the more expensive it will get. And that's the large problem if we don't prepare for that right now. And regarding pedaling back on sustainability, I'm pretty sure that won't happen for one purely geostrategic and economic reason. No, two actually. The first one is easy and gets overlooked quite often. If we are now talking about further permitting combustion engines in cars, for example, if you just have a look at your physics book and your chemistry book, some solutions that currently are in the political weather are actually quite clear also from a cost and efficiency perspective, if you think about it in the long run. Second one is a more political one. When the European Parliament came up with the question for the EU Commission to create a strategy that later became the Green Deal, that was actually to become independent from fossil resources that we currently get to a large degree from autocracies, from critical states, where we, of course, have maybe too much instability to be low-risk supplier, or where we don't want to support those systems anymore. And that was way before the full-scale invasion of Russia in Ukraine. I think the importance of becoming independent from resources from countries like Russia has been growing ever since. And that was the actual reason why they came up with, hey, let's do bioeconomy, let's do circular economy, let's get more independent from countries that, at least quite some of them, don't share our values, our thinking about how we should transform the world into a maybe better place, or our side on stability and political direction. So that won't go away, that even increased. And be it some populism currently to protect some industries that are slow on change, and that can also have some economical reasons, that's fine. But in the end, the process was started not from a purely environmental standpoint, but more like from a geostrategic standpoint.
Yeah, and I think geostrategically, it's also very important to be resource independent. I think, as much as you cannot like the US administration right now, the US has done, like, historically a very good job in being resource independent. So US is energy independent and food independent. They can produce pretty much everything themselves. The manufacturing, they're trying to get back. It's not a topic, but to push a little back on what you said and what's also on the slide. And I think after the talk, I had this question and this objection, because you said the bio-based materials, actually also what you're producing, you can also later introduce what you're doing with that. They're going to have lower risk. But I see also, like, from a regulatory side, I see also some risks for biomaterials, especially if they're made from the first generation feedstock. And I would start with that topic, first generation biofeedstock, which is, for the unintroduced, you are growing a crop in order to transform it into a chemical, or in this case, into a plastic. So you're growing sugarcane, you're growing potatoes, you're growing corn in order to transform it into biofuel or into bioplastics. And with that regard, how do you see that regulation coming? So are first generation biofeedstocks going to get banned? And secondly, does Europe have enough land to spare in order to produce its chemical on over the ground instead of digging it out of the ground?
So the use of first generation materials currently has some reasons that are let's say they are like they are. I, of course, would be the first one to take a second generation biomass, whatever scraps that we have left, and have a bioplastics made from that. And we are trying to push that together with partners so that the direction goes into, or the development goes into that direction. But it's economically quite difficult. Waste streams are waste streams because there is not a lot of concentrated high value chemicals in there, or substances. Like if you took out the sugars from a plant, what's left is a mixture of all sorts of other carbohydrates, proteins, whatever, and but usually in very low yields. And that makes it quite expensive and often also energy intensive to produce materials from, let's say, cellulosic waste streams compared to sugars. We for sure need some more technology and development of technologies that make maybe multi-step transformation from a feedstock towards a monomer more efficient, and biotechnology, I think, is going to that direction also. At the moment, it's at a price, or it would be at a price point that requires around 5 to 10 times the invest of using first generation biomass, and also with a carbon footprint that would be higher. And currently I don't see a market for that, as cool as it would be from an environmental standpoint, first place. The second thing regarding, can we do that here in Europe? Do we want to do that here? It depends on the way that we are doing economy. With a linear economy, I think that can work. There's numbers out there from IFBB in Hannover, for example. You need roughly 15% of the current agriculturally used farmland, so not pastures or anything, farmland. And you can make all of the plastics in the world from first generation biomass. That could be possible, also given the fact that 80% of the farming is done to feed animals, because we have such a high hunger for milk products, meat, etc. And also that we have a very high percentage of food waste, 25 to 33%, something like that. So I think there is enough space without deforestation, etc., to do that. What would not be possible, of course, is making bio-based fuels on that land. There we won't have enough farmland for plastics that's suitable, but it gets much easier and better on the environment if we are doing recycling to a large extent. If we get our recycling quotas up to 50, 70, 80%, even 80, I think is pretty much what you can achieve in the long term. Then we, of course, need 1/4 of the amount of land that we would need in our current economy model, where it has quite large portions of linearity, especially in healthcare.
Okay. I mean, it's always an interesting question to ask. So for the plastics, it wouldn't be impossible. For fuels, I mean, you can discuss if mobility is not going to be electrified. I think it goes into that direction, so that electric cars will be the main source of transportation. Question is just, what do you do with aviation fuel? There you will probably rely on fuel for a lot longer, because you just need the short-term power. And you cannot just jam that into a battery. I don't see that coming. But for the aviation, I mean, that's even lower in carbon footprint than the healthcare sector is. So the amount of fuel for aviation might be in a roughly similar magnitude compared to plastics, individual and transport, and also shipping and all the trucks. That is, I think, quite a bit more than aviation. So that, yeah, you have to search the right solutions for the right sectors, I'd say. Yeah, but per kilo is aviation is, or air freight is per kilo the most CO2 intensive. Of course, you don't do it because you don't do it everywhere, because it's also expensive, but it's also the CO2 or CO2 intensive, most CO2 intensive transportation mode. But coming back to a little bit about what materials are going to be future proof and whatnot. So what materials would you see as very prone to getting a compliance risk in the future, and which ones would you say as they're going to be acceptable long term in plastics? So the current trends that I see is pretty much the same candidates than like forever. PVC is critical.
for disposal reasons, as well as soft PVC for plasticizers. We see the discussion about BPA in polycarbonates being never green, basically, and currently also quite a bit in the spotlight, at least with customers that I speak to. And styrenics. Styrene isn't very great. And I currently see pharmaceutical industry pushing for the replacement of styrenics quite a lot also. So that's the three that are widely used currently, where I see that they have at least considerable risks, maybe even very high risks when we look at PVC, for example, because there also the market shifts. Might be that currently nobody asks if the lure lock is made from polycarbonate or not in the hospital, but regarding PVC waste, for example, they start questioning more and more. Or if we look at the Nordics, PVC free is, of course, quite a big thing there. On the other hand, for example, polyolefins, also the fossil ones, are relatively efficient in their resource consumption. They are good enough for many applications where we today still see maybe ABS or PC, like auto injectors that get replaced by polypropylene more and more. So that's something that might have lower risks because we also don't have that many critical substances in there, not inherently from the polymer. And if you don't choose additives that are critical, then they are also quite safe. And then there's, of course, new materials, biomaterials, PET, for example, also quite interesting for the future, having a great recycling system already. But on the new polymer side, if you look at PEF, similarly to PET, could be interesting. Take some years from now until it's commercially wide available, but interesting material in general. We are using PLA quite a lot. There we know exactly what's in there and don't see critical substances. Footprint is good. And of course, also the polyolefins based on biogenic materials. There's different approaches and ways to do that. They for sure have a very good environmental footprint compared to other plastics and a low critical substance risk.
Okay. I mean, I would add POM, so polyacetal, to the polymers with the certain compliance risks, since their monomer is formaldehyde. I mean, we can discuss how sensible these bans are if the materials have a certain environment, have a certain societal benefit. So these materials are not used for no reason. They're used because they have a pretty good performance to price ratio. And then is the question is like, how much risk are we going to accept for something like, and if we're talking about it, you didn't even mention it because it's so clear that something is going to get banned, is the fluoropolymers, because they're in with the PFAS group. And I think if we ban fluoropolymers from MedTech especially, what are you going to do with minimally invasive surgery? You're just going to do open surgery then? Because that is like has a lot or a very high impact on the patient outcome, because minimally invasive surgery is done for a reason, because it has minimal invasive consequences for your body when you do an operation on your heart, for example. So if you do a minimally invasive heart surgery, it's an in-out thing. 8 o'clock in the morning, you're there, and then in the evening, you go back. If you do an open heart surgery, it's like 6 weeks of recovery, and like a year later, your torso feels like it's there where it's supposed to be. So what risks are acceptable, and how do we get a risk-based approach in this environmental regulation thing? So that will be a question I have to you. I don't think that everybody has a recipe for success here, because we're just trying to figure it out. But what's your take on that?
I mean, there is difficult corners where you need special material properties when it comes to, for example, PTFE in minimal invasive surgeries, catheters, etc. Some of that is difficult for sure, but quite often we see a lack of openness in the designers' minds, or basically relying on what we've done forever. There's one example that I always bring up. It was a research project with a customer. They are doing endoscopic devices, and there they have a very open-minded designer, a cool guy, and he thought about, hey, why do we use PTFE currently? And of course, it's a combination of temperature stability, of low friction, it has nice properties for sure, but he thought about, hey, can I split up the functions that I currently all have in the PTFE part? And can I make maybe 2 or 3 parts that are from way less critical materials and still bring the functionality? And he did that, came up with a solution where we have one non-plastic part, and the heat problem was out of the way a bit, and where we have a polymer that still glides quite well, but is much, much, much less hard on the environment and also way cheaper than PTFE. And then you can find solutions quite often where you don't need fluoropolymers. There's other applications where you actually need a combination for sure, and there's no solution for every problem currently. But last year's MedTech Live, we had a podium discussion also about PFAS, and Jürgen Stebani from Polymaterials was there. And I mean, they developed new polymers also, and he said, hey, if we want, we can find solutions for quite a lot of the problems that we currently solve with, for example, PTFE. They've done so for automotive applications already. And the thing is, of course, you need to develop new polymers for at least some of the applications that we don't know yet. And that's a lot of work to do and a lot of effort to industrialize. There needs to be a market. It's costly. And I think that's holding us back quite a lot, together with the overspecification or the use of PFAS just for convenience. And there's 2 strategies that arise to me from that. First one is analyze where you can create your products without PFAS just by redesigning it or by thinking about what's actually the requirements that we have. And we too talked a lot about overspecification also in other fields. That's a common problem that we have in healthcare. And on the other hand, where we can't find other solutions, we should press for that and develop also new materials. And then I'm quite sure that there's just a very little field where we really, really need, for example, PTFE and can't replace it by anything else.
Yeah, I mean, I have a take on that. So what you mentioned is like, we've always done it like this. This mindset is very, very ingrained in MedTech. I think it's partially due to the MDR being extremely conservative and has this any, all, and always over requirement, as you call it, approach. I hope this is going to go away with the proposal that we now have on the table on the updated MDR. I haven't had time to go into detail there, but the promise was to have more proportionate safety measures also in MedTech. And so we've always done it like this is an issue that we're dealing with, an over requirement, because just to make it safe, we're going to take like the peak of the pyramid, either PEEK or PTFE, because that certainly works. That is certainly something that we can save a lot of CO2 footprints, a lot of environmental footprint, but also cost. You can save so much money by choosing the right plastic. And this is one of my biggest sales arguments. It's like, hey, come on, let's look at your materials and see if there is something in there that you don't actually need, where you're overpaying for the performance you actually don't need. And then what you said is, are there going to be new polymers? It's like, I'm a little more skeptical on that one. So of course, there are people who try to commercialize new polymers, but historically speaking, it takes 30 years to commercialize a new polymer. You need to, number one, develop the thing, figure out how to make it stable, figure out how to produce it on a small scale, then find investors to produce it on a middle scale. And then if you want to go commercial scale, depending on what field you're in, if you're a commodity, commercial scale means 1 million tons a year. And that is one plant. So, and then you need to build the damn thing, and then you need to go ahead and find customers for everything. And then those customers need to, if you're in healthcare, develop their product, figure out their production process, go ahead and approve the device, and then go sell it. And then you will see volume. And that takes 30 years. So I don't think that for fluoropolymers, we're going to see new polymers. We're going to see a bunch of polymers that are already in use that can take over certain properties of fluoropolymers at certain stages. For example, what works pretty well with friction is ultra high molecular weight polyethylene. This has pretty low friction. The problem is the processability, but if you need something with a very low friction, you can go ahead and try to replace it with that, or replace PTFE with ultra high molecular weight polyethylene. That is one option. If you need very high chemical resistance, you can try to go for something like PEEK. But if you need it flexible, you need it very electrically insulating, super chemical resistance, low leachables, and low friction. So if you need every little property that PTFE has, so it's actually the right choice, is very, very difficult. So I have this resectoscope from a very, very famous German supplier. They have this video online where they show, like, they have these two, I call it fingers, where a current springs between them and it's used to resect something. So like to cut away some tissue. And there's just no material that is able to have this performance than PTFE. So I think for some applications, it will still be PTFE. But as you said, if you're creative and if you're tackling the problem now, you will be able to find alternatives for some applications. And just to be clear, I'm not very much for the fluoropolymer ban, but I'm a realist. I don't think it's not going to come. So fluoropolymers are going to get banned. And even if you're getting an exemption, the availability of fluoropolymers are going to go down. So replace them now if you can, just because it's going to have an impact in the future.
Basically, just two small remarks on that. I'm a bit more optimistic regarding the new polymers. Of course, it's really difficult and long time so far. I think that is, especially for those specialty applications, that has also to do with political will. If the EU, for example, decides on, hey, that is a chance for our chemical industry here to have new innovative products that have actually some value creation within Europe, they could push a little bit more for the research and commercialization of those polymers. So I think that can be accelerated, but there needs to be some will, of course. The other thing is also in many applications, also minimal invasive surgery, you don't need all of these characteristics of PTFE at the same time in the same part. Also the electrical insulation, for example, that is really great with PTFE. There's other polymers that are quite good. They might not be as good regarding tribology, for example, friction. But if you split functions up, there's usually more than just a plastic tube or whatever. So there's other parts and you can incorporate functions on different parts. I know some examples where you can actually split up those combinations. It takes very open mind, creativity, and quite some work to do so. But that's, from a product designer's perspective, that's product development is where I'm originally coming from, besides fiber reinforced plastics back in the day. The possibilities are quite huge, but you have to do that in a very early stage of product development. Just as you said before, with changing materials, the later the worse. Same with the concept. You need to do a lot of concept work on your device. If you are doing that right, you can get rid of PTFE. I'm very convinced in many, many applications where you currently say, hey, but actually I'm using 2, 3 out of the 4 great benefits of PTFE technically, where you could split this up. But not if you already have the designed device and think about, hey, can I just exchange materials? Then it's getting much more difficult, of course.
Yeah. And this is a very, very great point you're raising here. Product development has the biggest lever over the future of your company. Of course, you knew that already. Product development has 80% of the cost that is defined in product development and design. It is 80% of your footprint that is designed in product development and design. And it's also the compliance that is going to be defined in the product design and development. So you need to, at the beginning of a product development, choose the right plastic. And if you don't, you're going to have trouble in the future. And replacing plastics that are already, let's say, in the field and production is going to be mainly reduced to something like drop-in solutions. It's extremely difficult to change from one grade to another, especially across plastic types. So replacing a polypropylene or a polycarbonate with a PLA with the running production is extremely difficult. You might have some insights to share on there, or you might just object to it because you say it's possible. But I have done these projects. It's usually a pain to do.
Standard answer there. It depends. Of course, in many cases, it is difficult, just as you said. And I'm much more a friend of the approach that you also said. Early on in development, think about what you're actually needing, make up the solution space, go with the right polymer. And for many products where you currently use, for example, polypropylene on ABS, that can be PLA. Not for all, but for many, I'm sure. But if you don't design the product accordingly to the polymer's characteristics, later on it's not the optimum solution usually, because design something in PP, replace it through PLA, it will be too rigid most of the times, or it will snap at some points because you have different elongation at break and a different strength, different stiffness. But sometimes it also works quite well. For example, we presented with Elm Plastic the dosing pipettes. There is a polypropylene or polystyrene plunger depending in there. They both work very fine from PLA, also in existing toolings. PS PLA, of course, is quite easy. PP PLA, a bit more difficult, but at least for trying it, for get a feeling for the parts, same tooling, same everything, gives you a first impression. But it definitely is recommended to do the design for the material in the first place.
That's my point. In the development phase, you have the biggest lever. The later you change the material, the more painful it's going to be, the more difficult it is to justify in your business case. And the overall more hassle it is usually. I don't say it's impossible, but it's going to be difficult. Okay, shifting a little bit the gears towards the more personal part. So you're a co-founder and CEO of your company. I was advised not to call you a startup anymore because you're so old now. So you're producing medical grade PLA bio-based materials for MedTech. Would you share a little bit about your story and some of the proudest successes that you had in the, I'd say, last year with your material?
Yeah, the story, maybe some of the listeners already know that, so I'll keep it short. We initially come from bone replacement materials. We always worked with biopolymers in biologically critical applications, so high safety was also always a concern. And we saw the huge amounts of single-use items, waste, etc. in the hospitals. That's why we thought, hey, let's bring the quite often very safe biopolymers towards more technical applications, devices, packaging, you name it. We've been doing that since 2020. That's when we started in full time, founded the company's beginning of 2021. And that always or also contributes to the large successes of the last year. The first products are in serious production and commercially available. That's housings of IVDs, for example, that we did with Zenova, Feosint, with Nal von Minden, and also the dosing pipettes, for example, with Elm Plastic that came out right now. In January, we will present some packaging applications on PharmaPack with different customers. So PharmaPack will be all over with BIOVOX, basically, and also drug delivery. So that's great dynamics that have happened in the last half of a year. We're using the different PLA grades that we have, but also bio-based polyethylene for these applications. And that's also part of our DNA. We are trying to be the first ones to have the new cool stuff in medical grade. So we mentioned PEF earlier. We started a collaboration with Avantium on that in 2025 now. It's a promising, interesting material. We'll see how that plays out, but at least good to know the name and to remember it for in a few years. Polypropylene, of course, big driver in replacing engineering plastics currently. We're on that also in a bio-based version. And also recycling topics, of course, are interesting. And we hope to present some concepts, ideas, and maybe even products on that also in the next year or in the next 2 years.
Okay. I mean, we're looking very much forward to it. So I'm always looking for sustainable plastics to use in medical devices. Also knowing that you have, I'd say, the foundation for medical in place, because you need the change control, you need the regulatory documents, because with all these other, I'd say, sustainable materials, they're very strong on the marketing front and very, very, very weak on the compliance front. And you just need that in order to be successful on the market. Good. So then I would come to my last question. What advice would you like to give in regards to sustainability compliance in the future of your materials to our listeners?
Yeah, basically coming back to what we've said, it's more like a recap. Think about it as early as possible. Incorporate it into the concept of your products or packagings, because that is the best also regarding cost and the impact that you can actually bring. You'll get the best out of the product if you're designing sustainability into the product. And also try to stay within planetary boundaries. Don't use critical substances that already are on the verge of being banned, because then you will reduce the number of changes quite a lot in the future. I think if I would have to boil it down to two things, then it would be those two.
Okay. I mean, I can also have a follow-up question on what you mentioned the last. So with your new products coming out made from your material, how is your customers' feedback from their customers regarding this new sustainable packaging or devices?
So far, very good. Regarding the IVDs, some of them reordered material way more early than expected. So they sold better than also the companies expected themselves. Regarding, for example, the dosing pipettes, there is also very good market feedback. They were presented at CPHI and the booth was pretty frequented. And also from what I hear from the market directly, there's quite a lot of the larger pharma companies, for example, that have that on their list and are looking into that, or also other companies that don't have sustainable products in these fields are getting more and more active and see that they are missing something if they don't do anything. So the dynamics are quite positive so far. The products work well. The customers did a great job at designing with the materials. We also tried to support as good as we could. So I think that's pretty much granted. They have their CE mark, so that's fine. But also from the commercial perspective, it's for the short term that it's out now, it's better than everybody expected.
Yeah, I think if you have a sustainable product on the market in 2025, 2026, you certainly have a strategic advantage for 2030. If you don't have a sustainable product on the market by 2030, I think you're going to have a strategic disadvantage. I will put it that way, a little more strongly than I think I formulated it until now. Currently, we have the front runners. In 5 years, you're gonna be late to the party.
That's pretty much what I would expect also. So do it now. It's way easier than being in a rush later on and just being the back runner.
Okay, cool. So perfect. This was Julian Lotz from BIOVOX, and until the next time.
Yeah, bye and thank you.